All right. Hi. Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure being here. My name is Irina, and I am the founder of the L&D Academy, among a few other things. The L&D Academy is an online educational space for learning and development beginners, mostly, but we also do have, obviously, some stuff for more advanced L&D practitioners. We really wanted to create a space, my partner and I really wanted to create a space for learning and development practitioners to safely learn. Most importantly, to learn practically what it is that they're required to do in their day-to-day job. There are a lot of myths around the work of L&D. There are a lot of books written on it, and very few of them actually give you practical tools. So we wanted to do something that's practical, something that people can literally take and just run away with it, and help them either get started again in their career as L&D, or to really help them kind of do better or do the best that they can for their organizations.
Sounds amazing. And I want to start by saying thank you for taking out the time to do this with me. There are so many people who want to learn about L&D. And one of the things that I find so amazing about your website and content is funny story. I was supposed to research for my firm, and I couldn't find anything that wouldn't bore me, for lack of a better term. I feel like I have to go through hours of video before like they would get to the point, because I had very less time to research. And then I came across your YouTube videos and I was so happy because I had that content out there. And what I love is it's a very elegant, well thought through and practical solution providing platform. So the website has various resources and courses that people can take up for L&D professionals, and I'd say even for people who've been in the system for a longer time, because you very nicely lay out questions that people can refer to when they have absolutely no idea. And sometimes L&D can be very abstract. So when there is some structure to it, it can be very easy. So again, thank you so much for doing this, and I'll get right into it. I have a lot of basic questions to ask you.
Let's get to it.
Yeah, so the first thing that I get asked a lot when I tell people I'm an L&D professional is what is L&D, right? So there's no idea.
Welcome to the club.
And they would mostly say that, oh, training, right? So, and then I want to explain better, but sometimes I feel I don't have the right words. So I would love to hear from you because you're an expert. If you can use an example, even better.
Yeah. The truth is that learning and development is kind of an umbrella term that is normally used to describe the process of acquiring any new knowledge, skills, behaviors that are relevant to any one particular employee, either for their current job or for any current future jobs that they may want to hold at some point in their professional development. Now, L&D includes a very wide range of activities, as you said yourself, training being probably the more popular one. And unfortunately for me, a lot of the misconceptions about L&D come from the fact that training is just one of those really visible, really there in your face sort of learning activity. So a lot of people naturally start to associate training with learning and development. The truth is, however, that there is so much more. There are things like coaching, there are things like mentoring, on the job learning experiences, project work, stretching assignments, personal development plans. There are, again, so many different learning methods that can really help employees to kind of develop and grow in their careers. There is a very famous saying by Abraham Maslow that if you're a hammer, or the only thing that you have is a hammer, then you tend to see every problem as a nail. So that's kind of the situation we're in terms of learning and development.
That's so interesting, and I love the quote. So another common problem that we face in L&D is that organizations see it as a good to have, but not a must have. And maybe I can speak for myself in the conversations that I've had with people. And these are people in startups and in MNCs as well. Very evolved organizations also see it as a good to have. And, especially with COVID and cost cutting and everything, people were looking at uh, eliminating L&D from their organization, because something like recruiting has a very direct outcome. So does other functions within HR. L&D being very fluid is very difficult to understand. It doesn't give you a very direct outcome. It's more subtle in the way that it functions. So if I had to ask you that, let's say you have to create a really good pitch for the organization and tell them that, hey, this is why you need L&D and it's an absolute imperative, what would you say to
Mm.
them? What would it consist of?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And you're absolutely right. I do want to preface this that you're absolutely right. Learning and development is not one of those straight down to the numbers, here's how we contributed to the organization sort of function. But having said that, there is actually a lot that L&D contributes to the organization. The very first thing that kind of pops to mind is improved employee performance. When employees receive training and development opportunities, at the end of the day, when you draw the line, they tend to be better equipped to perform their jobs at a higher level, more efficiently, leading to increased productivity, to better outcomes for the organization. And again, I do realize and I do accept the fact that it's not as simple as drawing a line between learning and development activities and profitability for the company, because a lot of factors contribute to, say, the profitability or the efficiency of the organization, or even the performance of a single department or a single employee. But there is definitely connection between the two. And I'm sure that at some point we'll talk about this, so I'll not mention any more in terms of how you do this, but there's definitely a connection there. Another very, very big contributing factor or a benefit really to having a learning and development function is the fact that it increases employee engagement. Once again, when you provide learning and development opportunities, this can really increase the engagement of certain people to their work, kind of improving their commitment to the organization. You mentioned talent acquisition. Well, I know talent acquisition works really hard to get the right people at the right places or in the right jobs. Learning and development is there to actually retain that talent.
Absolutely.
When people feel supported, when they feel valued through the various L&D programs an organization can offer, they're more likely to stay with that organization over the long term, thus reducing turnover and all the associated costs with it. And probably another thing that really comes to mind is the innovation and competitiveness. At the end of the day, a really good L&D function will kind of stay on top, stay on the cutting edge, if you will, of the industry trends, of best practices, leading hopefully to a greater innovation within the organization, which can then lead to a competitive advantage for the whole company. So again, there are quite a few reasons to have an L&D team within your company.
Absolutely. And you mentioned talent acquisition. I worked in recruiting for 3 years, and I would work really hard to get the right talent, and then they would leave in 6 months. But nobody
There
cared to
we go.
tell me what happened within those 6 months, that they didn't feel like they wanted to be a part of the firm. So there's so much of energy and resources that go into getting the right candidate. But the thing about a very high performing candidate is also that they need something which will contribute to their growth. Otherwise, they're not going to want to stick around. So I think there are subtle pieces that people miss out on how L&D contributes. And that brings me to my next question. I mean, assuming that we've cleared this and people are ready to get L&D on board, what are the basic steps to figure out what kind of learning program or training program to go with? And if you can break it down in very, very simple terms, what would be the first basic step? And of course, I understand the nature of organization will be different, the employee setting could be different, but I mean, if you could lay down just 3, 4 basic steps for anybody who
Yeah.
wants to get started.
That's another wonderful question. And I think it always boils down to something very, very simple. And that is ensuring that whatever you're providing in terms of a learning opportunity is relevant and applicable to the company. Again, be that training, be that some kind of a workshop, be that a year-long L&D program. It should be relevant to the job roles and to the responsibilities of the people who are participating in it. And it should provide them with some really actionable skills and knowledge that they can apply on the job. So the question then becomes, how do you do this? How do you ensure that whatever it is you provide is relevant and applicable? And the simple answer in theory is to conduct a needs assessment or a needs analysis. I say in theory because in practice, It's a complicated process. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of time, especially if you want to do it right. But at the end of the day, if you want to develop something that's really good, really effective, really improves the performance and engagement and retention and all the wonderful things we mentioned earlier, you do want to understand exactly what are the gaps in skills and knowledge that employees of that organization have, and then find a way to bridge it through learning, be that again training, on the job coaching, mentoring, project work, stretching assignments, secondments, job shadowing, whatever else it may be. So I think at the end of the day, this is kind of the big secret, which isn't really a secret.
Right. Okay. And you talked about training needs analysis and learning needs analysis. If you could just explain that further for people who wouldn't know what that is.
Absolutely. So learning needs analysis is essentially a systematic approach to figuring out what are the current skills, knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors of employees at different levels and in different jobs, and then comparing it to what the desired skills, knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors are. And again, it's fairly simple. This is what we have. This is where we want to be. So how do we bridge that gap? But again, in practice, in the real world, if you will, things are a little bit more complicated than that because, well, first of all, how do you assess everyone within an organization? How do you make sure that your assessment is as objective as possible? How do you make sure that you are, let's say that you have 1,000 employees within the organization, maybe even let's complicate it more, spread across the world. How do you then assess everyone's needs, right? So there are a lot of complications with that. But then the end point also comes with its own complications. For example, how do you know what are the desired skills and knowledge? And then that kind of leads you to the next question, which is, okay, so what does the company want to achieve in, say, a year, in 3 years, in 5 years time? Great. So then what is the strategy of the company? How is the company going to do that? A very simple example that I can give here was a few years ago, everyone was crazy about agile transformations, and a lot of companies wanted to move to an agile way of working. So L&D had this challenge in front of them to figure out, what does the agile way of working actually mean for them, for the organization, for all the different job responsibilities that they have within that company? So they had to kind of almost break it down, analyze it, understand what that is, so that they can then provide essentially the learning opportunities needed to bridge the gap between what people already know and what they need to know in, say, again, a year's time, 5 years time, or 10 years time. Probably no one does a 10-year
Yeah.
time analysis now that I think about it, but you get my point.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's very helpful and very insightful. So I just, wanted for people to know, if they just want to get started, there should be some very basic steps. It could be as simple as asking the question that what is it that this profile requires to begin with? Do we even have clarity on what skills do we need, so that we can map it and then figure out what is the gap that, we need to fill or, upskill people on. So, and I'm sure the next question you get asked a lot: how do you really map the efficiency of a training or a learning program? Once it's out there and it's launched, how do you figure out if it's actually doing what it's meant to do? I'm sure there are like surveys and there's other data that you can gather to see if it's doing well. But because it's so abstract and so, I don't want to use the word vague, but I think you get my point. It's a little difficult to like sort of figure out if it's working well or not working well. So if there could be 2 or 3 indicators that you see as an L&D professional when you know, okay, this program worked well, what would those 2, 3 indicators be?
So there isn't a single answer to your question. And the simplest one is it depends, because it depends on the program, it depends on the training, it depends on the content, it depends on the organization, it depends on the stakeholders for that particular program. And I can just give you an example just so you understand. Let's say that we are developing a leadership program for an organization, and that leadership program is for, let's say, first-time managers. Okay, so these are people who have never been managers in their previous careers or up until this point in their professional development. So we need to then establish what does what will a success look like for that particular program? So we could say, okay, well, we need these first-time managers to understand, for example, how to give feedback, how to conduct one-on-one conversations, how to delegate tasks, let's say how to, and I hate saying this, but I'm going to say it anyways, how to communicate effectively, because this isn't a metric, it's a wish list, but you get my point. So all of these
Right.
things, we need to then understand what is the end result?
Right.
And then, just to take it a step further, to make sure that it's not a wish list, but it's an actual metric that we can easily measure, this is where we ask, okay, how will we actually know this? And so we try to put some numbers to it. We try to make it more measurable, more specific. And it could be that maybe we collect some feedback in the beginning of the program and end of the program, and then we compare the results. You know, how well did that person delegate before they joined this program and after it, or communicate, or conduct one-on-one conversations, or give constructive feedback, and so on. But then let's say that we're doing a training, a one-off training for, let's go with customer services agents, okay? So these are most of the time younger people, either still in university or right after university. They are working potentially minimum wage jobs. So we are there to give them, let's say, an hour-long training on, I don't know, phone etiquette, right? So the questions that we ask ourselves would be the same, meaning how successful, or how will we know we've been successful, right? That question is going to be the same. The other question is, how will we actually measure this? Again, same question, but then the answers you get underneath both of these questions are very different, because where with managers or first-time managers, we were looking at kind of very specific skills in terms of delegation, communication, feedback, conflict resolution, and so on. For customer support agent, we now need to understand things like conflict resolution, things like greetings, things like managing expectations, things like being polite on the phone, and so on. So you see, again, it depends. The process would be more or less the same. You would be asking yourself, how will we know that we are successful? That's essentially the question you always want to be asking yourself when you're evaluating something. But then the answer will depend on, again, the topic, the stakeholders, the learners, the organization, even the program.
Right. Right. Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And moving on to another problem that we face is motivation. So just to give you some context, what happens is that employees are working a lot. So they're working 12, 14 hours a day. There's email fatigue. And now when there are nudges to ask them to, let's say, complete a particular training or finish a course, for them, it's not something they're looking forward to. They're more irritated or agitated by it. And I had a conversation with a relative of mine who happens to be at a very senior position in a consulting firm. And she said, I've got a husband and I've got kids, and I have worked 12 hours a day, and then I'm expected to do this. And I realized that a lot of people's perception of L&D, at least I can say from my experience, is that it feels very like they have to do it, so they'll do it. And given that now it's virtual, it's not in person, so there are people who are very disinterested, they get disengaged after 15, 20 minutes of it. So would you have any theory for why that could possibly happen, that people aren't motivated? Or do you think, is there something that can be done to tackle that situation? Can we employ better programs? Can we do something to understand our audience or employee set better? What could we do to better the motivation factor or aspect of the learning?
This is a very good question, and one that has a lot of different layers to it. So let's try to unpeel just some of them, because I don't think we'll be able to unpeel all of it. First of all, learning is one of those things that you can't really force, right? You can make someone learn something new unless they want to. This isn't school, this isn't uni. We're all adults here. And this goes back to kind of one of the key adult learning principles. Adults need to have a reason to learn something, right? It could be that they'll do their tasks faster. It could be that they'll earn more money, which again is a possibility there. It could be that they will reduce some administrative work for themselves. Whatever it may be, they need to know what they will gain, what's in it for me. This comes from marketing, the WIFM, the so-called WIFM, what's in it for me. They need to understand what they will get out of, let's go with this example that you shared, a training. Another layer I think has to do with social media. So bear with me here for a second. What we've seen in the last few years is a rise of TikTok-like content. And it's not just TikTok. We also have Snapchat, we have Instagram, we have YouTube. But what's interesting about these particular newer social media platforms is that they try to engage the user in very short bursts of time, right? A TikTok video is like 30 seconds long and then you move on to the next thing. And so fortunately or unfortunately, I personally tend to side more with the unfortunately side of things. This means that nowadays, a lot of people expect content to be presented to them in these short bursts. They're almost programmed to expect it. And so if anything takes a lot of time, they're like, yeah, I'm bored, I'm out of here.
Right.
I say fortunately or unfortunately because it could be a blessing in disguise, or it could be a tough challenge for someone who's used to, doing lengthier programs and just kind of looking at things from more perspective than just a 30-second clip. Another layer has to do with who initiates a training. And again, I'm using this particular example, but it could apply to pretty much any learning and development method here. I've literally had cases where I walk into the training room and I see someone there at the back of the room with their hands crossed being like, okay, you train me now.
Yeah.
My manager sent me here, so this is a day for me to kind of relax, so you
Not
train me.
Yeah.
So it goes back to really ownership and responsibility and accountability for your own development. I can give you another example, again, from leadership development particularly. I work with a lot of clients in my consulting agency who are either designing and facilitating or just designing and then they facilitate themselves a lot of different leadership programs. And one thing that I've noticed is that it's a lot easier for them to go to the HR business partners and say, okay, who from the business could benefit from this program? And I hate this push approach. I say it's a push approach because it is. You are essentially pushing people to attend the training, to do coaching, to do mentoring, whatever. What I much prefer is the so-called pull approach, where you announce the program, you describe the benefits of that program, you describe the learning objectives, you describe everything that you think would be beneficial and would help people kind of imagine themselves in this program, and then you open it up to nominations, right? So if I see it and I think to myself, oh, this program sounds like it could actually be very useful to me, hang on, let me apply, let me prove that I'm worth the company investing time in me.
Right.
And so the pro in this approach is really that you're kind of weeding out the people who are just sitting there in the back of the room, right? Motivate me, train me, do something for me. And I think another layer, and I don't know if it's at all backed up by science at this point, but I think another layer has to do with sort of understanding how learning can be integrated into the day-to-day of people. And your relative was absolutely right. Everyone is swamped with work. After the invention of the 5-day working week, a lot of people sort of theorized that in the 21st century, we will work less, not more. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. But I mean, we used to work 7 days a week, then it moved down to 6. Now we're down to 5. Everyone thought naturally we're going to go down to a 4-hour or a 4-day working week. Very few companies want to test it out still, unfortunately. But my point is that, yeah, everyone is busy, everyone is swamped. Right. So I think that's a challenge for learning and development, to find a way to integrate learning into the day-to-day instead of piling on top of. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I'll give you another example. I recently was contacted to develop a very short program for uh, feedback. It was about giving, about receiving, about reacting to feedback, so kind of all perspectives on feedback. Um, and yeah, of course, kind of the natural reaction of the client was, oh, I need this to be a training. And I said, okay, let's pump our brakes. Let's try to do a bit of a needs analysis. Let's try to understand how people learn best.
Yeah.
And then let's try to integrate it into their day to day. And so we did. And we figured, yes, training will be beneficial to these people, but only to a certain extent. They actually needed to also have opportunities to practice. They wanted to kind of test it out in the real world, but also practice in a safe environment. And so we provided these opportunities for them. And it was a lot more effective than if we had just done the training and be like, okay, now you're off you go, you do you, we
Yeah.
do us, and then that's it. That's the end of it.
Yeah, I think three things that I think are very interesting. I was about to talk to you about microlearning versus like a comprehensive training program, because I'm always, even though I have to admit that I also enjoy like shorts and everything because they're quicker to
Yeah.
consume. And I am guilty of it. But if I really think about it, I love long podcasts because it gives me some head into of what I'm studying and what I'm reading. So I need some context. So I've always
Mm.
preferred like a longer format. But because of the whole micro learning and because of the shorts, YouTube shorts and Instagram, people are expected to know everything because it's the age of information. You're expected to know everything and you want to know everything in 30 or 90 seconds, which is very difficult, specifically if you're looking to change a habit within the organization. That's not going to happen with a quick reel or a quick training program. It's going to take a lot of practice, like you mentioned, right? And I agree with you on the push and pull because in the organization I was working prior, we would send so many nudges and so many reminders. And I would be like, these are associate directors. Why are they being pushed to do it? They should want to do it if they want to do it. So I've always been
Yeah.
about that, market it really well, get the nominations so that they also value the investment that the organization is making, right? So that they want to opt for it and they get to choose what they want to learn, right? Instead of like expecting them to learn everything. So, I mean, I got my answer there. Would that be correct to say that you prefer longer formats of training as compared to shorter formats, or do you think it depends?
So do I prefer it? I think it's not so much, or it shouldn't be so much about your personal choice, but rather what works for your audience.
Got it.
Because, again, it could be very effective for delivering just in time training or addressing specific knowledge or skills gaps. However, at the same time, that more comprehensive, let's call them training or learning programs, may be more appropriate for more complex, more in depth topics, and may provide learners with a more holistic understanding of the subject matter. So at the end of the day, it's not so much what my personal preference is, it's much more about what would work for your learners. And I think that I'll try again. I think that should be the driving force behind the decision what learning method to use. Again, going back to Maslow's quote, if all you have is a hammer, then you tend to see every problem as a nail.
Right.
If I prefer only longer content, then that's what I would do. And that doesn't necessarily cater to all of my learners.
Sure. Sure. Absolutely. That makes sense. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about ChatGPT. So I have to really talk about it. And I really want your view on it because I have watched the video that you created on ChatGPT. But
Yeah.
there's so many conversations around it. And recently I had a conversation with my ex-boss on how creating content is something where we don't want to hire people anymore because scripts can be written, content can be written on ChatGPT. So apart from jobs getting redundant and that being a serious scare, I also want to know, how do you think ChatGPT will change the course of L&D for good or for worse? Like, how do you think it'll impact the way in which it'll work really well and also like be bad for the people working within L&D?
Yeah. So I'm going to be very subjective when it comes to ChatGPT because ever since it came out, I've been using it and I absolutely love it.
So do
I
I.
think it works wonders for my line of work. My husband is a software developer and he has tested it and it doesn't work as well for him. But for my purposes, it works wonders. It saves me a lot of time. And this is what I absolutely love. But I think it's important for us to understand that ChatGPT, as well as all the other artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies, are probably here to stay. I don't necessarily think that this is a fad. I think this is something that will start being integrated into our day to day more and more. And so I think that L&D would be fool not to take advantage of this and not to use it. Again, there's this concept that AI will take away our jobs, which I personally think is ridiculous. If your job can be taken away by AI, then it shouldn't have been a job in the first place. That's my personal opinion. And again, I told you that I was going to be very subjective when it comes to that. But I think learning and development can definitely leverage not just particularly ChatGPT, but really all the AI tools that are kind of popping up recently for their benefit. You can promote a culture of continuous learning and development. You can promote a growth mindset within your employees. You can promote things like critical thinking, creativity, adaptability through the use of these types of technologies. So I definitely think there is place, or there should be place, for AI and ChatGPT in particular.
What I love about that is how accepting you are of what is here to stay. And I'll just like give you an example. I was the first person to get on ChatGPT because I'm very curious
Okay.
about anything that comes out. So I'm asking really random questions, okay, just to test it out and like have fun with it. So it ranged from L&D to like, I don't know, yoga poses to anything. Okay, just research.
Okay.
And later that night, like my husband just refused to use it because he was very skeptical of it. So I told him, I said, whether you like it or you dislike it, it's here to stay, right? So you
Exactly.
can try and not use it, but you're going to have to eventually use it. And he was very scared because of the whole background of ChatGPT and how it could use your information. But ever since that happened and my conversations after that around L&D, I thought it can benefit a lot. There's a lot of time, uh, that's wasted in figuring very basic things out, which are related to content, which you don't need to do anymore, because that takes away
Mm,
from actually using the talent for better purposes, right? For maybe higher order thinking or, for strategy.
exactly.
So it's,
Exactly.
yeah. So you're wasting time in just figuring out what to write in an email. I feel like that's a waste of time. We don't need to do that anymore. So I agree
Exactly.
completely. And I think my only last question is that if you would love to bust some myths about L&D, what would those be? Like things that you are tired of hearing and you would would know. Like when I was studying psychology, people would come and say that you're studying psychology. Tell me what I'm thinking, right? So I got to a point where I said, how is that possible? I can't read minds. I just right. So it was that random. So something that you're so tired of, like listening about L&D, which isn't true.
There are quite a few myths in L&D that I'm very tired of hearing, but one of the biggest ones has to be the training bit. L&D is not training. Stop saying that it is. I'm really tired of hearing it. I realize that a lot of people don't mean anything bad by saying it.
Sure.
It's just a lack of understanding and knowledge. And that's why I've made it my mission to educate the world that L&D is not just training. So yeah, this is the one and only myth that I will. It's a hill I'm willing to die on. So to speak.
Wow. Yeah, because I remember on your website when you were introducing with your partner, and I was going through the video, and you said that you used to introduce yourself as like that also for the longest time. So
Exactly.
I'm sure that didn't come from a space of anything negative, just being more aware and knowing how you could describe it in a much better fashion. For
Yeah,
sure.
exactly. I have in one of our courses, we kind of ask people to, once we talk through what learning and development is, and we explain kind of all the intricacies and we explain the depth of the field, we give them this exercise. Explain what you do as learning and development to three people: a child, a student, and a CEO or a manager.
Oh, I love that.
Um, and that is a wonderful exercise in kind of trying to figure out who it is you're talking to, and then crafting a message or modifying a message so that it suits that person's understanding and needs. And so, in kind of the spirit of that, saying that learning and development is like a trainer
Yeah.
is probably what you would say to a toddler, because that's how much they know.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
if we actually consciously and intentionally educate the people we talk to on a daily basis about what learning and development is, and really busting that myth that it's all about training, then I feel that we can have much more rich
I
conversations
agree.
and more in-depth conversations about how we can actually help the business.
Right, right. And I think whenever you relegate anything to any simpler concept, what happens is it takes away very fine nuances of how it could actually, like you said, richer conversations around it, right? So if you simplify it, it's good for an understanding purpose or a starting point, right? So there's no harm in starting with saying, oh, it's like training, and then you build on that. But it
Yeah.
sometimes it takes away from the essence of what it really is. And lastly, because it completely skipped my mind, like I was telling you while we when we started this podcast, was that I love how you've created certain questions and certain worksheets and workbooks. I was amazed by it. So I really wanted to know, how do you go about creating that? Because personally, I think that's very difficult. It's one thing to have theoretical knowledge, and then to
Mm,
break it down in something more tangible.
yeah.
And substantial is very difficult, and I've struggled with that. So I just wanted to know, like, how do you go about it? What's the thought behind it?
Another excellent question. I don't think that I've actually thought about it consciously, but now that I do, it all goes back to my experience. I was very frustrated in the beginning of my career that there aren't a lot of practical tools or resources that I could use as L&D practitioner or as an L&D beginner even. So I had to learn through a lot of trial and error. And every document that we create, every template, every step-by-step guide, every uh, process that we put together, every question, if you will, that we craft comes from our own experience. It comes from a place of frustration that we didn't have that back in the day. But now that we've been through that, now that we've experienced those uh, trials and tribulations, let's call them, now we know what would help you. And so everything that we design for our website, be that a free resource, be that we have something called the Ultimate Toolkit for L&D, where we essentially create new resources and templates for L&D practitioners. Every single one of these resources that we create comes from a place of knowing how frustrating it can be not having that document. I can give you a very simple example. Right now, I'm consulting with a learning and development practitioner, and she is undergoing a very extensive learning needs analysis. And she was wondering where to start. It was something very simple, like, where do I start? What kind of questions do I ask? And we actually have a learning needs assessment question bank. It doesn't have every single question under the sun that you could ask in a learning needs analysis, but it gives you a good enough starting point to then build on top of it. So, this is just one example, again, of something that I wish I had many years ago. Well, not that many years ago. I'm not that old.
You don't look
But
that
just
old.
thank you. But I just really wish I had that in the beginning of my career, because it would have saved me a lot of looking up online, trying to sift through tons of information, trying to understand. And this is, by the way, just a very quick note, there is just so much information out there, and it's very difficult to sift through what works and what doesn't work, especially if you're new in the business, especially if this is your first time doing L&D. So you see a lot of conflicting advice and best practices and resources, only to spend a day looking up stuff only to figure out, oh, this doesn't work for me, right?
Yeah,
And so this is where all of these documents come from.
yeah,
And
but
then the beautiful design comes from my partner. She's all on the design side.
yeah, I mean,
I
the
try,
way
but I'm nowhere near as good as her.
now in terms of the content and like I mentioned earlier, I did go through a lot of podcasts for work, for the work that I was doing. And I love the fact that it was short, it was concise, in whatever capacity that it could be. There were resources and it was free, which is a good thing because sometimes you just need a little bit of practice to get a certain sense of what you're doing and you know how to start. And I love that those resources are available for everybody because I personally, downloaded them and I used them and they were very helpful. So again, I was very intrigued to know that your experiences and how you break it down is incredible in the way that it's done because sometimes people struggle with it a lot. So thank you so much for that. It's incredible. And
I'm going to do a very shameless plug now. If you want to get more of these resources, we try to post at least one new freebie on our social media. It's not going to be available anywhere else on our website. You can only get it from our social media. So make sure to follow the L&D Academy on LinkedIn, on Facebook, even on YouTube, because we do post all of these freebies there as well. But we do have, I think it's 9 free resources on our website in our library, which you can access, and it's about starting your career, pre-course planning, post-course reflector, so a lot of different things. But then also every month, at least once, we will feature a new freebie that you can download. And again, it's only available on our social media, so make sure to follow us there.
I love that. It's not a shameless plug at all. It's a very relevant plug. I think people can really benefit from it. So I think more power to you. You should go and do that more often. Thank you so much, Irina, for taking out the time to have this conversation. I've had a great time. It's been so insightful. Thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, not at all. Thank you for having me, and I really love talking to you. So thank you for the wonderful questions.
Thank you so much.